As for the 3D side of Blender's painting system, in the 3D view, we'll jump over to texture paint mode, where we basically have a duplicate tool panel of our texture paint settings, including brushes, color selection, palettes, basically the exact same options. Remember, these are seamlessly integrated. And so for the 3D side, the biggest difference is that we're not painting a picture as much as we're painting onto an object. So this is really very intuitive for the purpose of texture painting. Before this was possible, painting the 2D texture apart from the 3D model required a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking, so to speak. And so now we have the ability to paint in 3D right on the model, which is a really great way to work, especially for the artistic types. And so some differences in the 3D view. Right now we're looking at purely the texture data. So remember, there is a mouth on our monkey. There's also a nose and eyes that we can't really see distinctively. And so if we switch the viewport shading mode to solid, now we see the texture information with some basic viewport shading. And so depending on what you're painting, you may want this on or off, off being pure texture information. And then another thing about painting in 3D is the idea of occlusion, meaning if I paint on my eye right here up front, just like if I was painting with spray paint in reality, this surface would block any paint from getting on the rest of the model. But in 3D, we need to define this. Now, by default, it is defined over here in our Option tab of the tool panel. Under the Project Paint dropdown, we have Occlude, Cull, and Normal checked by default. And so if we turn those off, and I'll switch my color, or perhaps use the Fill brush to fill everything blue. And I'll just click a few times to make that happen. Now let's choose this green, and back to the Texture Draw brush, and the Occlude settings. Okay, with this off, make sure my color is not on the same blue. If I click on my eye now, and then rotate around to the back, you'll see that it has been projected through the model and also exists on the back side. And so we have the option to occlude and cull. These typically go together, which means that if I click now on this eye, it's not projected to the other side. And below that we have a normal option, which if I enable that, I'll go ahead and set the value down to 0, which is like a threshold value. And what you'll notice now is when I paint on this surface, you'll see that it starts to fade out, where it's really, really strong in this section, but as my geometry starts to face away from me, the paint gets weaker. And so to better illustrate this, I'm going to jump to Object Mode and add a Subsurface modifier, change the views up to 2, and then also set the shading to Smooth, where now that we have more geometry, when I jump to Texture Paint mode and demonstrate this normal value, you'll see better what it's trying to do. And as I paint, you'll see that it's very strong in the middle and it fades out. Now this fading is based on the geometry and how it's facing us. And so where it's strongest, this surface is looking directly at me, whereas these surfaces along the faded edge are not facing me directly. And so increasing this value, let's say to 20, will change how this functions, and the threshold will grow a little bit. And so this is valuable where if I turn normal off and let's paint right here, there's going to be a very harsh, often stepped edge that can become a problem, especially if I'm using a lower strength. So if I wanted this to be a weaker version of my red, when I try and paint over here now, it's added on top of each other in the middle. And so that normal value can be useful to remedy that issue. And then below the normal setting, we have a bleed value, and that has to do with how our 3D paint strokes are transposed to the 2D version. Because remember, even though I'm able to paint in 3D, the texture is always going to be two-dimensional, as we see in the UV image editor. And so I'm going to switch my color again and jump over to the Fill brush, and let's use this green, and we'll click a few times. And now when I zoom in to the border of our UVs, there's a couple things to notice. Number one, thanks to the Subsurface modifier that we added, there's an option here that's checked by default, Subdivide UVs. So if I make my window a little bit bigger, we can see the effects of the subdivided UVs as we have filled in the 3D view. So if I disable that and then use the Fill brush again, you'll see that we now fill all the way to our unsubdivided UV borders. And that bleed value that's over here in our Options tab That's telling the paint system when it transposes from the 3D stroke to the 2D image to extend 2 pixels beyond the UV border. So if we turn that to 0, you'll see the problem comes in when, let's choose a different color and fill again. You'll notice that due to the pixelation of our 1024 by 1024 image, there's a discrepancy between the pixels and the true UV border. And so how this manifests in the 3D model is the UV seams start to stand out, and we get this artifacting. And so it's a good rule of thumb to have the bleed value above 0. I think 2 is the default. I'll often bump it up to be safe to like 5. And now you can see when I click with the fill brush, the seam artifacts are gone and our color is extended beyond the UV border. And so that's some differences with 3D painting versus 2D painting. But by and large, they are the same painting system and they work seamlessly together, which makes texture painting a very powerful feature with Blender.